Hello students, welcome to the class. So today we are going to talk about another topic in general psychology, which is called as perception and different factors involved in it. So the main objectives of this lesson are to understand what is movement perception, and then we are also going to discuss what are the internal factors influencing this perceptual experience, and then we are also going to talk about external factors influencing perceptual experience. Now let us see what is movement perception. As in the name it suggests, it is the perception of movement, and it is an aspect of spatial perception and is the process of inferring the speed and direction of elements in a scene which is based on visual input. Although this process appears very simple, it is proved to be a difficult problem from a computational perspective and extraordinarily difficult to explain in terms of neural processing. It is a process through which we tend to orient ourselves to our own or others' physical movement. For instance, when we are traveling in a train which is moving, we can see that some objects are also moving across and some much faster than others, and the faster objects are those which are very close, such as electrical pole or anything which is just beside your train or could be in the railway track, and slower objects such as trees which are very far away. The disparity in their movement is a cue that one is farther away from you than the other. The far away objects are nearer than the slow one. Movement perception plays an important role in visual perception. It is used not only to calculate speed and direction of moving objects, but is also important for control of one's own body and eye movements. It is the process of inferring the above said aspects which we discussed and are also based on visual, vestibular and proprioceptive inputs. The mechanisms that have given stable and clear visual inputs, even with other blurring facts, this kind of reflex mechanism we call it as optokinetic nystagmus, which is a feedback mechanism that ensures that the eye moves in the same direction and at almost the same speed as an image. Hence, the eyes pursue a moving scene to keep the image stationary on the retina. Now, let us see what is movement after effect, which is also called as MAE. It is a phenomenon where the visual movement after effect probably arises when movement detectors in the brain which responds to the original direction of motion become tired, in turn leaving the predominant of those detectors which respond to contrary movement. For example, a sailor feels the land to be rolling like ship as a result of kinesthetic and vestibular after effects, even though he gets off the ship. And for suppose you have the opportunity to view a waterfall, just look at the falling water for about a minute and then allow your gaze to all on any stationary object, for instance any building, and then after you do this, the texture of the perhaps even the windows will appear to move up. This particular phenomenon of motion after effects has been studied intensively by visual scientists for many years, and it is seen that the visual system has motion detectors that, like most neurons, undergo spontaneous activity. We do not see motion when there is none, because the spontaneous activity is in balance. As we have seen the movement perception, now we will see what exactly apparent movement is. Apparent movement is a sensation of movement in the absence of an actual movement, especially a class of visual illusions that arise when two visual stimuli are exposed at 2 centimeters apart or displayed in an alternating pattern. This concept was first studied systematically in the year 1912 by a very famous German Gestalt psychologist called as Max Wertheimer. He said that if each stimulus is exposed for about 50 milliseconds, then with an interstimulus interval below about 25 milliseconds, the stimuli, though possibly flickering, appear to be simultaneous. With an interstimulus over about 400 milliseconds, there is no illusion, and the stimuli which seem to alternate between 25 to 400 milliseconds under certain conditions, which we also called it as Coates' law, have the tendency to have this powerful illusions of movement which are created. Hence, apparent movement is also called as apparent motion or phenomenal motion in natural images of real scenes. Moving object change position in the image in a very smooth manner or in a continuous manner. If one could inspect the image over shorter time periods, this shift in position would become smaller and smaller until infinitely small time intervals. It is also possible to create the perception of movement in an image by changing the position of an object suddenly over a relatively large distance, and one could inspect the image over sufficiently in a very short time periods. For example, if 4 or 3 still lights come and go, it will create an impression of steady movement. Such effects of apparent movement is also called as visual pi phenomenon, in which an optical illusion is created when stationary objects are shown in a rapid succession. That is, the movement takes place when in actually there is no movement. The process on which this particular apparent movement depends is a tendency to fill in the spaces between adjacent visual objects. For example, you can see the particular picture which is there. This is a perfect example of apparent movement. So, when you continuously see this picture, there is a tendency to see the picture as moving or the circles as moving together. So, this is one of the example of apparent movement. Now, let us talk about stroboscopic effect. Stroboscopic effect is also known as wagon wheel effect, and it is a visual phenomenon of human vision where a moving object is perceived as standing still or even moving in a different direction that is actually moving. As you can see in this particular picture, a picture of a wheel. Sometimes in our everyday life also, when you observe the cars and you observe the wheels of the cars, you see the particular stroboscopic motion where it appears to be still or it appears that the wheel is going in an opposite direction. So, this stroboscopic phenomenon is a visual phenomenon which occurs when continuous motion is represented by a series of short or instantaneous samples. It occurs when the view of a moving object is represented by a series of short samples as distinct form of continuous view. The moving object is rotational or other cyclic motion at a rate close to the sampling rate. A typical example could be a fountain where a stream of droplets which are falling at a regular interval and they are viewed under a strobe light. It is a specialized light or a device that is used to produce regular flashes of light. So, when that is seen under this strobe light, when its frequency is tuned to the rate at which the droplets fall, the droplets of the fountain appears to be suspended in mid-air, and it looks like the droplets seemingly move slowly up or down, which does not happen in normal light. So, this wagon wheel effect is a kind of optical illusion where a spoked wheel appears to rotate differently from its true rotation. The wheel can appear to rotate more slowly than the true rotation. It can appear stationary or it can appear to rotate in the opposite direction from the current or the true rotation. The wagon wheel effect is most commonly seen in film or television depictions of stage coaches or wagons in Western movies. Motion picture cameras conventionally film at usually 24 frames per second, although the wheels of a vehicle here in the wagon wheel are likely to be turning at 24 revolutions per second, and that would be extremely fast, isn't it? And suppose each wheel has 12 spokes and it totters at around 2 revolutions per second and all filmed at 24 frames per second, the spokes in each frame will appear in exactly the same position. Hence, the wheel is perceived to be stationary. If the wheel rotates a little more slowly than the 2 revolutions per second, the position of the spokes is seen to fall a little further behind in each successive frame, and therefore, the wheel will seem to be turning backwards. Now, as we have seen movement perception and apparent motion and stroboscopic effect, now let us talk about factors influencing perceptual experience. And before we go to the factors, let us have a small introduction about perception and then go towards the factor. So, perception is a process by which we tend to organize, select and interpret different sensory stimulations into a meaningful information. Most of the research shows that individuals may look at the same thing, but may perceive differently. For example, if a person in the office takes many days to take a decision, then his superior may interpret that person is disorganized and afraid to make decisions. And with the same situation, other manager may interpret that person is thoughtful, thorough and deliberate. So, it depends upon how you perceive it and under what circumstances. How can we explain that individuals may look at the same thing and yet perceive it differently? And for this, a number of factors operate to shape and sometimes disturb or distort this perception. These factors can reside in the perceiver, in the object or target being perceived, or in the context of the situation in which the perception is made. When an individual looks at a target and attempts to interpret what he or she sees, that interpretation is heavily influenced by the personal characteristics of the individual perceiver. Personal characteristics that affect perception includes a person's attitude, his personality, his or her motives, interests, past experiences. The characteristics of the target also makes a difference in perception. Loud people are more likely to be noticeable in a group than the quiet ones. The relationship of a target to its background also influences perception, as does a tendency to group close things and similar things together. For example, women, people, color or members of any other group that has clearly distinguishable characteristics in terms of features or color are often perceived as alike, and other unrelated characteristics as well. As you can see in this particular picture, there are two people standing apart, but they are perceiving the same number as differently. One person is perceiving it as 6, one person is again perceiving it as 9. So, the same number can be perceived in two perspectives, again depending upon where they are standing. So, this is one of the best example of how perception differs from people to people depending upon place and time. Then this perception can also be influenced by various factors in terms of internal and external factors. Internal factors refers to needs, desires of individual, personality, etc. Now, let us see what are the internal factors influencing perception. The first one is needs and desires. A person's needs and desires play an important role in perception. People at different level of needs and desire tend to perceive the same thing differently. For example, a person who is socially oriented may pay more attention to interpersonal stimuli and adding to the expectation level too, and it affects how we perceive different things. The next factor is motivation. Under motivation, these motivational factors increases the individual's sensitivity to those stimuli which we consider as relevant to satisfaction of our needs in view of our past experience with them. Now, another factor is personality. Personality, as you know, plays an important role in influencing perception. For example, people who are optimistic tend to perceive things in a very positive manner, unlike pessimistic type of people who perceive negative in every possible way. And same thing goes for some people who are secured. They tend to perceive other people as warm and kind-hearted. The next factor is learning. Learning again plays an important significant role in developing the perceptual set. People tend to perceive things according to their learning and role of learning, and is much more pronounced in terms of complex manifestations of perception, where symbolic content comes into the process. Another factor are the habits. Individuals perceive objects, events, situations and conditions differently depending upon their habits, and in several instances in life setting where individuals tend to react with the right response to the wrong signals. Another factor is the experience. A person's experience can also influence the way we perceive things. Experience and knowledge have strong influence on person. Successful experience increase the perceptual abilities and might also lead to accuracy in perception of a person. Next are the moods. Moods can have a strong influence on the way we perceive someone. We sometimes think differently when we are happy than we do when we are depressed or sad. In addition to it, we remember information that is consistent with our mood state better than information that is inconsistent with our mood state. When in a positive mood, we form more positive impression of others, and when in a negative mood, we tend to evaluate others unfavorably. Next aspect in internal factors is self-concept. It is seen that an individual with a positive self-concept tends to notice positive attributes in another person, and in contrast to it, a negative self-concept can lead a perceiver to pick out negative traits in another person. In addition to that, the greater understanding of self allows us to have more accurate perceptions of others. Next aspect in internal factors is interest. The main focus of our attention appears to be influenced by our interests because our individual interests differ considerably, and what a person notices in a situation can differ from what others perceive. For example, a supervisor who has just been reprimanded by his boss for coming late to the office is more likely to notice his colleagues coming late tomorrow than he did last week. If you are preoccupied with a personal problem, you may find it hard to be attentive in the class. Don't you think so? Now we have covered internal factors of perception. Let's see what are the external factors of perception. In terms of external factors, the perception of an event, object or a person is affected by various characteristics of perceived object. These might include, the first one is size. It is said that the bigger the size of perceived stimulus, the higher is the chances that it will get notice. For example, if you go through a newspaper every day, you tend to notice the bigger headlines and columns first when compared to the smaller ones, which are the paragraphs. The next one is repetition and frequency of the stimulus. The stimuli which gets repeated gains more attention than the single one, and repeating of the stimuli is frequently used technique in advertising and is the most common way of attracting a person's attention. The next factor is movement. People tend to pay more attention to a moving object than the stationary ones. For example, if you are in a railway station waiting near the platform, and from the number of trains which are there, you tend to attend and perceive the train which is moving at first when compared to the stationary one, isn't it? Then another factor which affects this perception is called contrast. The external stimuli which stands out against the background receives more attention when compared to the stimuli which does not stand against the same background. Now let us summarize what we have learnt. Perception is the process by which we attend and interpret a stimulus. There are different types of perception, and one of them is called movement perception, which means to perceive things which are moving. When we experience movement perception in this scenario, there are a lot of interesting things which happen. For example, when you are traveling in a moving train, as we have discussed, and when you look out from that particular window, you can see the nearest object tend to cross the opposite of you, and if you see the objects which are far away, they tend to go with you, and the disparity is the cue and gives information whether the object is near or far. There are different types of movement perception, such as apparent motion, which is also called as pi phenomenon, where we tend to perceive steady objects as moving, and stroboscopic movement, where we tend to perceive moving action at certain velocity tend to look steady or the same. Hence, the way we perceive around the world is influenced by different factors, and they again influence the perceptual experience. And then there are different kinds of factors or characteristics which influences this perception, and can also be divided into two major kinds in terms of internal and external factors, which are specific to the perceiver, that is the internal factor, and the external factors are those which are specific to the perceived. Internal factors of perception includes needs, motivation, personality of the individual, etc. Whereas external factors of perception include size, intensity of the stimulus, movement, contrast, etc. Hence, these factors determine how things are perceived by different things by different people all around.